All right, so let's go ahead and get ready for our first panel. And our first panel, Avik is going to be the moderator. The panel is called Expanding the FreeCon Coalition. And our panelists, Daniel Garza, Mark Tooley, Kristen Soltis Anderson, are either here or in transit. Here we go. And so we're going to go ahead and assemble on the stage and begin our first panel. Thank you all very much for coming, and I'll talk to you a little bit more later on.
Thanks, John. All right. I'll sit here in the middle. Is this on? Okay, I guess it is on. Sorry about that. All right, we got everybody. Great. Well, I'm just going to get right into it. John claimed that the principles that we talk about in the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles have broad appeal, that most Americans believe in them, maybe not all, but most Americans believe in them. So, Kristen, you're the expert on that topic. Tell us, what is the state of how Americans think about these topics?
It's a great question. I want to first thank you for inviting me here. Thank you for the great work you're doing in encouraging the continuation of these debates. I know after elections, oftentimes it's assumed, well, whoever won the election, they sort of get to set the agenda, they have the ascendant viewpoint. And there are many things about the election in November that are very instructive and are great news for those of the broader right of center, but I still think they're interesting debates to be had, and I'm glad you all are interested in having them. I think there are a lot of interesting opportunities on the right, because at this moment, with the center-right kind of rethinking where does it stand and what are its principles, I think there are some interesting opportunities, as well as some moments where I would say freedom conservatism really does win. Americans do not love the idea of government controlling what they do. They do not love the idea of government taking what they've earned. These are pretty timeless principles that we find a great deal of support for. And interestingly, if we're thinking about these debates as being within the right, there are a number of areas where when we just ask those who think of themselves as Republicans, which isn't necessarily the same as conservatives, for sure, but we've done this interesting experiment at my firm, Echelon Insights, where we ask folks who consider themselves Republicans to choose between two competing statements that we have tried to make as fair a fight as possible between two competing right-of-center viewpoints on an issue. We find, for instance, that when we pit against each other, the U.S. is better off when we are a strong leader around the world, versus the U.S. is better off when we are focused more on our interests at home. That even among Republicans, 54% choose the former over the latter. At the same time, you can take a finding like that and see that there are interesting generation gaps where it is true that more Republicans may lean towards saying, yes, we want a robust role for America overseas, ensuring that free markets and the rule of law can prosper and that we are safe. At the same time, it is a new generation of those who think of themselves on the right that choose the latter perspective, that say, you know what, I do think we need to be looking more inward. I think we need to be putting American interests first and see us being too engaged as being problematic. There are other places where, for instance, you talked about federalism. When we ask our respondents things about the hot topic of abortion, and is this something where you think that the federal government ought to have a set policy, or do you think that this ought to be left to the states? 2/3 of Republicans these days think of it as, let's leave it to the states. They still believe that this is something that is best handled at that closer to the ground level. And finally, when we ask Republicans, do you believe that the government should be bigger and provide more services, or smaller and provide fewer services? We find that only 1 in 4 Republicans say that they actually think the government should be bigger and providing more services. So there are certain ways in which this vision of kind of big government conservatism is falling flat within the right. However, there are a few things that I find in our data that I think are good warnings for the folks in this room. First and foremost was a question we posed about, should the Republican Party be the party of entrepreneurs and job creators, encouraging economic growth and low taxes, or should the Republican Party be the party of working people, ensuring they can keep more of what they earn? 69% of our respondents chose the latter, only 23% chose the former. I think that's important to keep in mind because I think a sin of conservatism over the last 2 decades has been talking a lot like the former, We are the movement of job creators, of economic growth, of economic liberty. And a lot of folks are working people who just want to keep more of what they earn. And so being smart as a movement about our messaging and who we're reaching is what's going to enable us not just to have those who are already sympathetic to the right of center, but those who ideologically are not right of center at all, but merely feel like at this moment it is those on the right who are doing a better job upholding the rule of law, doing a better job of trying to secure our border and keep us safe, doing a better job of helping working people keep more of what they earn. And that, to me, is where I think the biggest opportunity lies.
I mentioned in my opening remarks the fact that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, there was, for a time, a bipartisan consensus that free markets were the path forward. So it wasn't just Republicans or Republican voters for whom this was a consideration. What do your polls say about how Democrats are thinking about these issues?
So right now, in some ways, a lot of the polling we see is Democrats, in the same way that Republicans have done this too, it's really, what does Donald Trump believe? And then I choose either to support him or I choose the opposite. And so you see this more robust view about free trade among Democrats, if only because Donald Trump has been so vocally on the other side of the issue. But don't make for one second the mistake of thinking that the Democratic Party today is a party of free markets. They very much still have this view that the system is rigged, it's rigged against average people, and therefore needs to be torn down.
Let's go over to the other side, to Daniel over here. Daniel, you are a guy who spends a lot of time with the grassroots, your organization. Yes. That's all you do, really, is spend time with ordinary people who are trying to navigate life. How do the ordinary people that you talk to, particularly in the Latino community, how are they thinking about these issues?
Well,
do you agree with Kristen's take? Do you have a different take?
No, I do. I do in the sense that they are looking at right now. There's an inflection point where the Latino community has swung over tremendously over to the center right because they are seeing that it's the right that's doing things proper. More, I think they're honoring American principles. A lot of that were enumerated by the speaker. And I think they're seeing them play out in the way they govern as well. You have to keep in mind within the Latino community, for decades, the center-right refused to take yes for an answer and engage with the Latino community, show up even. It was a conversation in the Latino community that was dominated by the center-left. Spanish language television, tilt center-left, unions, center-left, 501c3, 501c4 Latino organizations, the only ones that existed at the national level or on a national scale, center-left. The party itself invested more, the Democrat Party, to engage the Latino community, to register and turn out Latinos. And the center-right had stayed away. And so for the most part, everything they learned about how to govern in America was coming from center-left voices. That had begun to change. And now they're seeing the alignment with their values, with their priorities. And what we needed to set out to do, this was almost 15 years ago now, when we started the LIBRE initiative, was, well, if the party ain't gonna do it, if other center-right organizations ain't gonna do it, then I think we need to do it, Latinos themselves. And so we knew that we needed to, in a way, we've operated under the principles, obviously to advance the American principles, but under basically trying to get across two sentiments. One sentiment was, we care about you. And, it sounds kind of, hokey or whatever, but if people feel you don't care about them, then anything else you have to say doesn't really matter. And so how do you prove that you care? Well, you show up. You listen to them. You listen to their priorities. You present your ideas to them that resolve those issues, those priority issues to them. You make your case. You have to make your case that your ideas are superior. So you care and that your ideas are better. If you're not showing up to express those two sentiments, you're not winning the game. You're not, you can talk about all the ideas, but in the Latino community, when 30% of us only speak Spanish, when 33% of us don't have a high school diploma, adults, when 50% of us in some states don't have a driver's license, these are major barriers to opportunity. And you're talking about highfalutin ideas, about when people hear that you're here, to talk about the redistribution of wealth and things like that, they want to know what you're going to do to redistribute knowledge and opportunity, equal opportunity. But when you have these barriers, you don't really have equal opportunity, do you? So what are the policy remedies that are going to help them to put them at, at an equal position in the marketplace? And so just driving those conversations, showing up, talking about the solutions that are going to help, bringing elected officials to them, I think is going to make the difference, has made the difference. You're seeing now the center-right candidates who show up, massive shifts in votes in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Nevada, in Georgia, Arizona, Texas. In Texas, almost all the border counties went Republican. That's incredible, folks. We have, last thing I'll say is Monica de la Cruz, my congresswoman, where I'm from, in South Texas, in her first election, in the previous election cycle, flipped a blue seat. This was a seat that was held by Democrats since Teddy Roosevelt. That's how much it's changing in South Texas with the Latino vote. This is a county, 85% Latino. 7 of the 10 largest Latino counties in the country went Republican. Think about that.
And Daniel, would you
Because
say
we're
that
holding a conversation with them.
would you say that that's because, so the shift politically in terms of the voting, was that because Republicans just showed up and were there to try to recruit people, and they were the voters were already aligned in terms of the policies and the values, or was it that voters' views of the political issues and the policies and the values evolved as Republicans started to compete more for the votes?
Yes. Yeah, when they showed up and started talking about, what they believed, when they started expressing these American principles, because they kind of, Latinos sit up and say, yeah, that's what I believe. Where's that been, right? All I'm hearing is everything else, how to defund police and God knows, all these sort of crazy ideas, right? And that's been sold to them on the green agenda and whatever. And so some person with common sense shows up and starts talking about these American principles. And that's what I came to America for, or that's why my parents came to America for. It's the land of opportunity. As Woody Guthrie said, they came to the mountaintop. It was a rich green valley with a river running through it. There was work for every single hand, they thought. There was work for every single hand. America's the land of opportunity, and it's only the land of opportunity because it's American principles that make it so. The free market, a limited government, the property rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all these things that they inherently, instinctively believe in. And so when somebody comes around and starts talking about these principles, that's my guy.
See, that's interesting because, Daniel, the narrative on the national conservative side is that we have to not only secure the border, which I think most people believe in, but we also have to reduce or eliminate legal immigration because people who are coming to this country from other places, like Latin America, don't have American values. And if they come here, they're going to dilute American values. Talk about that a little bit. What's your firsthand experience?
I think America's been very fortunate in the sense that a lot of our immigration over the last decades has been from south of the border, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, mostly because Christendom, right? Our values they're shared values. It's very easy to assimilate one Christian with another. It's a little tougher, when the religions are different. So, but in whole, the values are the same. And I think instinctively, when folks come in, they are searching for freedom, for opportunity to, make a better place for their family and themselves, and they find that in America. That is exactly what is happening. So I think it's been a very easy assimilation when it comes to the Latino community. And again, when you start expressing these ideas, these policy remedies, the light comes on. It's very easy.
That's a perfect segue to Mark. So Mark, you've been involved in, I don't know exactly how to describe it exactly, maybe you can describe it, but the Christian side of the conservative movement for a long time. There's been a lot of talk about how Christian conservatives have evolved politically. What's your assessment of the last 10 years of Christian conservatism, and where are they now? I know you can't generalize because it's a very diverse group, but from your vantage point.
Well, I can't generalize, but I will because I have to for the sake of time. You're absolutely right. There has been a great change among religious conservatives. The state of play is very different from when I came of age in the 1980s, the 1990s. I would say during the early years and first couple of decades of the so-called religious right, they would have been by default in sync with the principles of freedom and free markets, limited government, free trade, friendly to reasonable immigration, and that has changed dramatically over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. The good news is the old religious left, which my organization was founded in part, has largely almost disappeared, supporting Marxism back in the 1980s and certainly being statist up until current times, but their constituency has dissolved. So all the ferment and the drama is largely on the conservative religious side, which many of whose adherents, not most, but many of whose, are now more skeptical of freedom principles, skeptical of free trade, skeptical of limited government, hostile to immigration. They see classical liberalism as being secular, utilitarian. It came from the Enlightenment. They like Patrick Deneen's thesis that it was wrong from the start. The founders themselves were kind of wrong, or at least they were operating on some bad premises, and so they're moving into a more post-liberal field where they want large government, they want strong politicians, they want control and authority. If you noted John Hood's reference to his remarks about opposing the merger of church and state, well, why is that even an issue? That seems remarkable after 250 years, but there are now many smart young men on the right, religious, Catholic, and Protestant, who do want, in fact, to merge church and state, and who openly talk about having a confessional state because they think the separation of church and state has been a disaster and facilitated progressivism. The anecdote that I love to share to anyone who will listen is 7 or 8 years ago when I first started noticing this trend, I went to a DC happy hour for, I think it was Christian ethicists, and there were well-known people there, David Brooks, Ross Douthat, and a young man beckoned me over and introduced himself, and he said, "Oh, I used to be a Methodist from Ohio, but now I'm a Salazarian integralist." And I just sort of trying to download what that meant. Integralists, of course, are Catholics who believe that the church should be legally and politically paramount in society. So that's been a trend among young men in the last 10 years. Salazar.
How big of a trend is that? Is it really a trend, or is it just a handful of people writing books?
It's smart young men who are online, and obviously they're a minority, but they can't be dismissed because there's a lot of intellectual and spiritual energy there. So that's what we're up against, and so the freedom principles that we could have just assumed were widely assumed, almost universally assumed among religious people up until 10 years ago can no longer be assumed. So we have to make the basic arguments now.
It's a bit of a head scratcher to me, I have to say, because do we really want the government in charge of religion in this country? People are confident that that's going to lead to good outcomes?
It's very bizarre, and I would say the trend of much of Christianity, and certainly Protestantism, has been very suspicious of centralized authority, much less governmental authority over the church. But I think their perspective is everything has failed, so we need to be open to something new, dramatically new.
How much of it is, in your estimation, the fact that one of the big transitions we've had, and there have been some books written about this, the fact that the America of the 1950s and 1960s was not merely a majority Christian country ethnically, but in terms of people going to church. Even today, Pew polls suggest that I think it's 55% of Americans say religion is very important in their lives, of which the vast majority are Christian. But there is this sense among many, particularly politically active religious people, that, particularly among Christians, that they are now a minority, and that's why they're reaching to things like government power to say, okay, let's have the government enforce these things that we can't seem to enforce in terms of just what people believe in the country.
Well, that's the paradox. As affiliation with formal religious institutions has declined, there's been a segment of Christianity arguing all the more for some kind of merger of church and state, which seems completely illogical, but perhaps it's a sign of desperation. But the troubling aspect of it is that religious Americans used to be the chief celebrants of civil society, and in some ways, many of them are giving up on civil society and wanting to rely on the state. But if you have more confidence in your faith, you should have confidence. No, we can actually persuade people of our perspective. We don't need the state to do our work for us.
And this brings us back to you, Kristen, because you've done a lot of work. One of the things you specialize is in polling younger voters, and you've documented probably more than anybody the rise of people who have no faith at all among millennials. What are we seeing among Gen Z? Are those trends even growing even more? And what do the nuns, the N-O-N-E nuns, believe?
So I'm actually going to give you an anecdote about nuns, N-U-N-S.
Okay.
You set it up perfectly. There's an article that is stuck in my mind that I believe came out about 3 or 4 years ago that was studying trends in young women who are choosing take up a vocation in the Catholic Church. And that essentially this is a challenge in the Catholic Church now, is to get young people to become either priests in training or nuns. But that the young women who were choosing this path were often opting for the most conservative of the different orders that they could join. That there was a sense among some of these young women that they simply were not finding meaning in modernity. They were not finding meaning in the life that young women growing up in America nowadays often are handed or are experiencing. And so they were finding meaning by being very, very, very radical in their religious beliefs and going for something that was very outside the quote-unquote mainstream. The reason I bring that up is that I think right now for Gen Z, what I worry about for the next generation, and I saw this a bit for millennials, but you're right, the trend away from traditional religiosity is continuing. And I worry that for this generation, there is this real search for meaning, that in some cases is turning from I'm going to find meaning through faith to I'm going to find meaning through politics. I'm going to find meaning in that direction. And that I think it should be a core principle for freedom conservatives to ensure that we are thinking about how do we construct a society that allows people to feel meaning from their work, meaning from their family lives, meaning in what they do day to day. Because if they can't find meaning through their hard work, if they can't find meaning through their family or through their communities, they will seek it out in other ways that are potentially less, I'm trying to think of the
constructive.
Constructive. That's a great way to put it. And I especially think this trend toward viewing politics as a replacement for religious meaning is something that's really, it does trouble me quite a bit.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up. I don't know if you've read Eric Kaufman's book, White Shift, but it's a very interesting book about the rise of nationalism in the West. And one of the things he observes empirically is that nationalist sentiments have particularly been most potent where religiosity has declined, that it's basically become a substitute. Ethno-nationalism has become a substitute for religion.
Interesting.
Well, let me just open it up to three of you. Pipe in whoever wants to. Just how should people in this room, how should freedom conservatives, what are the best ideas that you have for how to expand the constituency for the values that we're trying to articulate here?
Well, I mean, I guess I could start. I can express what we've done. We've pretty much worked in 3 tracks. One is that you need to be a part of the conversation, right? You need to go into the communities. You need to be on their media platforms. So with the Latino community, we have about 8 to 10 spokespeople, surrogates, who are expressing our ideas, doing counterpoints to the left, on Univision, on Telemundo, on Fox, Newsmax, talked to a gentleman from there, all over the place, right? You just need to reclaim, wrestle away, or paratroop into new platforms to drive those conversations. That's one, either paid or earned media. 2, you need to be a part of the community. We are an organization, a C4, a C3, and a PAC. And all those 3 entities where we operate, we are year-round. We don't leave after an election. We stick around. We help people, thousands, get a driver's license, get a GED, learn English, get citizenship, we have become a trusted advocate within the Latino community because we are the community. When we talk about immigration reform, I think we can do border and we can do expanded legal channels. We can do both. And when we talk to them about it, we become a trusted source because, look, they're our neighbors. We go to school with them. We go to church, with fellow Latinos. They're our family in a lot of cases, folks who are undocumented. We are going to be their champion. And they know that, that we are going to be a voice on their behalf. So being a part of the community is very important. And 3, you need an army. You need to get out there, actually, and ask people to go and vote for your preferred candidate, for your policy champion. Whether that's, we operate in a way that we endorse at the federal level and at the state level, even sometimes at the local level through referendum. We have thousands of volunteers across the country that visit fellow Latinos, again, their neighbors, the people they go to church with, they go to school with, their family members, through a database, a data system that we have, where we now have 7 million names of Latinos who we know where they stand on the ideological scale, whether they are left, whether they are central, whether they are right. And when it comes down to a race, I don't know, Juan Ciscomani in Arizona, who won by 0.5%, and we went and visited with over 200,000 Latinos in that district and won by 2% in his reelection. It matters, where the Latino vote is swinging towards, but you have to go ask for their vote. And you have to go have personal conversations with them about the issues that matter to them. And what are the policy solutions, and who's the policy champion that is offering those policy solutions? This matters. Again, these conversations that you need to be holding with the community, and you have to stay. You have to keep coming around. You have to become a familiar person with them. So not a one-time shot. No silver bullet either.
Mark, with young Christian conservatives, what are the arguments you find that are most persuasive when you engage them on these topics?
Well, we're hosting tonight our monthly, we call it a New Wiggery dinner, W-H-I-G-G-E-R-Y.
We got to spell these things now.
Yes, we do. And some of you in the room have been speakers at this dinner, and if you're under the age of 39, you're welcome to join us tonight. But basically making the argument that freedom principles are largely Christian principles, the idea of the dignity of the individual, the idea that the Creator has made us creative, and we should have a right to fully exercise that creativity. And when speaking to evangelicals, making the special historical point that freedom principles or classical liberalism, this was arguably largely birthed by Dutch and English Protestants in the 1600s and carried forth across the centuries. So if we help to develop this tradition, we need to be good stewards of this tradition.
I think especially I'm thinking of younger Americans, being culturally relevant, showing up, as you said, is so important. And I think there are times where this pendulum swings, right? I remember back in the mid-2000s, the New York Times Magazine did a piece about the young Republicans, about how it was cool to be conservative on campus. And then obviously the pendulum swings, you have the whole Obama era. I write a book about how dreadfully uncool being Republican is at that point and what the movement needs to do to win them back. The pendulum does feel like it has swung again, that the right has captured some measure of cultural relevance. And the important thing to remember there is that it's not just celebrities. This was, if you went back and read the Republican autopsy that came out in 2013 after Mitt Romney loses, one of the prescriptions to win over young voters was we need more celebrities. Maybe we need a Republican celebrity council. With all due respect to Kid Rock, he is not, more Kid Rock is not the answer. It's not a problem, but it's not the solution either. That cultural relevance means showing up where people are and speaking on their terms. An example I will give of this actually comes from the other side of the aisle. I think AOC, for all of her incorrect views, is very smart at this. She, for instance, about a year or two ago, began going on skincare influencers' podcast shows on Instagram. And it wasn't to go on and say, the state must nationalize the means of production. It was to go on and say, you can get better sunscreen when you go to Europe and Asia. Why is it that we can't get those sunscreens here in the US? And so would have these conversations with these skincare influencers about how the FDA approves or doesn't approve things and why you should call your congressman and demand that you be allowed to use this different sunscreen. really, really focused on that audience, wasn't going in with a strongly ideological message. Frankly, I think you could argue it's kind of a conservative message. The government was getting in the way of you buying a good sunscreen. But it was meeting people where they are, who probably are never going to turn on cable news. They're never going to pick up a paper copy of the New York Times or anything like that, but they are going to watch skincare influencers. And suddenly there's a politician there who's speaking their language, who's talking about things that they care about. I think that's the challenge for those of us in the freedom conservative movement, is find those opportunities to get outside your comfort zone and deliver your message in places where people who otherwise are not interested in following the day in and day out of politics and policy are open to hearing what you have to say.
One of the things you just touched on that I think is worth pulling out a little bit is this point about how the media landscape has evolved. You're somebody who's on TV all the time, which is one of the reasons we're grateful that you're sparing some time to be with us today. You've been able to observe this firsthand. Do you feel that the nightly news or the Sunday shows or whatever it is, the cable news shows, that their influence has declined and the influence of these podcasters and influencers has meaningfully changed? Is that measurable? Because that's something people say. Is it measurable? Do you feel like that's really true?
I feel like it depends on what influence you're talking about. I'm not sure that the Sunday shows ever had a great deal of influence with Americans under the age of 40. I don't think if you went back to the 1990s, you would have necessarily found that either. And so there is still a level of influence, in this town among opinion elites or what have you, but there is a real sea change happening where you can now have someone like a Joe Rogan, as you were mentioning before, who has a very different audience looking for very different things. And it's just, there are more opportunities for influence, more channels for influence than before. It's not just a matter of there's one really big microphone and it is going to influence all of the people who care about following current events day to day. There are now 1 million different microphones. And smart folks who are interested in truly expanding their movement will look for opportunities to grab as many of those microphones as make sense to make their case.
One of the things that's also interesting, and Joe Rogan's example of this and these influencers that you're talking about before is so much of the criticism, the kind of, the kids today kind of criticism, back in my day, is that, well, today we live in this attention economy where everyone's got ADHD and they're scrolling through their TikTok and whatever. And yet, it seems to me that the most impactful, at least among the most impactful things, are these 3-hour-long conversations. Yes. It's not just the scrolling through TikTok. Absolutely. And that's having an effect too. But.
Yeah, and I think the key word there is authenticity, that people feel like they are actually listening to someone who they can trust, who is really saying what they believe, right or wrong. I think that is what it feels like there is not a lot of these days. And so when you feel like you found it, you're willing to commit a lot more time to trying to absorb it.
That makes a lot of sense. Any further thoughts on how we expand the coalition?
Yeah, that was a very important point that she was making, and I want to stress that. Sometimes, it matters who shows up at your door. If it's somebody who has shared hardships, going through the same struggles, inflation was debilitating to the Latino community. They were barely getting by from week to week. A lot of them were scraping their knees in prayer that they could, make the payments at the end of the month. And when someone like that shows up at your door and talks about what are the policy remedies to that, that matters. They'll stand up and listen. I'm one of these weird one-offs. My parents were farm workers. I grew up in the state of Washington in the Yakima Valley. I was a high school dropout. I turned on the channel one day and I was flipping through, landed on PBS, and it was William F. Buckley, a firing line. And William F. Buckley, I don't know what he was talking about. I don't even remember what the topic was, but he spoke to me, right? And I couldn't wait to see him the next week and the week after that. And I identified as a Republican because of William F. Buckley. It was a long-form interview. It was talking about the kind of issues that mattered, right? And so I don't know how many Latinos became a Republican because of William F. Buckley, but...
Who was, I believe, born in Mexico.
Fascinating. The point is, somebody was finally saying the things that I believed in, that I instinctively knew. That's it, right? That's America right there, that I believe in, and why we have opportunity. And the reason why we've been able to accommodate for flows of millions and millions of poor immigrants and improve their lives like no other country has before was because of our free market system, because of equal opportunity, because here in America you have a chance. And to drive those conversations in long form has been important. It's a game changer. And that's what young kids are listening to. And I talked to my son, Daniel, he watches these podcasts. You're right, it's the sincerity too. It's what they're picking up on. It's folks, who are going through they're at the same age, going through the same things, the same angst about the future and what this country is going to look like. So we need to be a part of that conversation as well.
We've got some time for questions, so there's a mic right here in the center. If you want to ask a question, just walk up to the mic and line up. Mark, this authenticity question, how are people authentically speaking about faith today? Do they feel that they can't, or do they feel like they can be? Does it feel like today the climate in 2025 America is more open to people talking about their faith, or less open, or about the same?
Oddly, even though, as mentioned, formal religious affiliation is declining in America, people who are religious seem more and more outspoken about their faith and feel more and more adamant about their faith. And there are polling stats to show that those who remain religious are more religious than ever, interestingly. But to the larger point, I think in making the freedom arguments, we have to understand whether we're speaking to a religious audience, whether we're religious ourselves. America is still overwhelmingly a spiritual project. Our language, our politics are still in some way spiritual, and so utilitarian arguments, I think, ultimately won't fly. When we make freedom arguments, they have to be rooted in a creative spirituality.
There's no doubt about that. Just to amplify the point I was making earlier, about 55% or so of Americans will say religion is very important to them in this question that Pew asks around the world. In the typical continental European country, it's about 17%, 11 to 17%. So in UK or France or Germany or Hungary or whatever, it's very low. Actually, Italy, I think, is one of the outliers. I think there it's like 25% or something like that. But it's pretty low in those countries, but it's still very robust in America. And that speaks, I would argue, to Adam Smith, actually, in 1776, wrote about this. He said, the thing that America has is this lack of a state-based church. That forces churches to actually try to go out and appeal to people. When you have a state-based church, the people who run that church or that parish don't have to actually try to appeal to you. It's taxpayer funded. It's like they kind of run that particular geography. They have a monopoly. But in America and in particular parts of England where there was religious freedom, that wasn't true. You had to actually compete for people's allegiance. And that's what led to more, you could say, charismatic but more appealing religious denominations over time. As a mainline Protestant, I see this all the time.
Well, and I also wonder, thinking back to our politics now, to what extent political success also leads to I now no longer need to go work as hard to win over people, because look, we did it. To the extent that Republicans and the right have had success with younger voters in the last couple of years, a lot of that is because Democrats sort of put up a mission accomplished banner and said, hey, we've won them over, we've got it, and could take them horribly for granted and allow the leadership of their side to grow older and older and older with no interest in handing the baton over, and it really created an opportunity. Similarly, I wonder if you see the same thing with the left sort of taking the Latino vote and Latino supporters for granted, saying, hey, we've picked them up so dramatically since the mid-2000s, there's no way that they would ever go back to conservatives. And I think the lesson for that on the right is that even if at this moment a lot of folks are feeling, hey, our ideas are ascendant and our side has won, never to take it for granted that those voters are somehow with you forever. You must keep trying to win them over, keep trying to show them how your ideas make their life better, and never stop doing it.
Yeah.
You know what you're reminded? Go ahead, Dan.
No, I was just going to say, in the 50s and 60s, Latinos were compelled to do walkouts, protests, marches. It was all uncouth, right? There was sometimes some violence involved. They were on the outside looking in. When you're not listened to, when you don't have a seat at the table, that's all you can do, to get attention. And it was the Democrat Party who reached a hand out, through John F. Kennedy and RFK. And at the time, Ronald Reagan was anti-union, ipso facto anti-immigrant, farm workers, because the UFW was making a play at the time. And it created this distancing. And so when you have a party that's reaching out to you, will you embrace it? And that's exactly what happened. But to your point, it got lazy, right? It did take them for granted. And it has started to impose an agenda onto the Latino community and stop listening to the Latino community or what their concerns were, what their priorities were. And they're paying a heavy price now because the party that is listening to them and that is addressing their priorities and is offering policy solutions is the Republican Party. And look at that swish that's happening.
You know, we've been talking a lot about people of faith and their importance in the conservative. It's important to also note that the Elon Musk and the Joe Rogans, they are not particularly religious people, right? And it was prior to the Clinton Democrat was basically someone who was, the Bill Clinton Democrat was a free market person who was turned off by the religiosity of the Republican Party in the 90s.
The coalition right now holding the right together, it's going to be a big, interesting challenge to watch over the coming
All right, we do have some questions. Go ahead.
Thank you for the remarks. For decades, we have tried different strategies to expand the conservative movement and electorate with arguments about morality and about the morality of markets. Could you speak to developments in the last few years about national security, war in Europe, war in the Middle East, and how the different constituencies that you've been talking about view conservative principles in light of Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, other places in the world?
All right, before you answer that, let's get the other question in.
Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion of public opinion and and bringing different groups into the fold of freedom conservatism. I was wondering if you had any comment about the political approach. Is this going to be best accomplished by trying to persuade existing Republican legislatures or mounting primary challenges explicitly under the freedom conservative banner, or how the explicitly political approach to expanding freedom conservatism might
Okay,
work?
so foreign policy and national security, and then what's the political opportunity?
I can very quickly answer that first question. So right now, when I look at the data, there's a huge generation gap on the right when it comes to what should America's role in the world be. If you are over a certain age and you remember the United States winning the Cold War, if you remember what it meant to try to promote American values around the world because there was an existential question in countries around the world, what type of system will you have? And America wanted to win it. If you come from that generation, then you believe that yes, it is good for America to be out there projecting its power around the world, that we live in a better world when that is the case. And if you are under the age of about 40, you don't think so. Throughout the course of your life, it's hard for you to point to a time where the American projection of power led to something concrete and good that you think was worth the blood and treasure. And so there is a massive divide I see in all of my polling around foreign policy and younger versus older conservatives and what they think the appropriate role for the US should be on the world stage. And that has consequences for the debates we're seeing over what should America's role be with regards to Ukraine and so on and so forth. But right now, younger voters, and in fact, it is particularly young conservatives, who believe very strongly that America is a great country, they're proud of their country, and they want to see America's efforts focused at home first and foremost before trying to turn outward, because they frankly aren't that sure what we get in terms of our own interests when we do turn outward.
Dan, quickly, do you have thoughts, since you're the most politically active here, on how to get
when you're engaging Latinos, talk to them like Americans. And we love America, God, family, like everybody else does. All issues are Latino issues, so don't leave anything out. Drive those conversations. I think we just double down on what we're doing, which is beginning to engage, beginning to open up, those conversations in the communities with the Latino community. And more than anything, I think nothing is equal to one-on-one conversations. Which is, I think, what we do best, and we're going to continue that. But at the same time, policy matters. This issue of immigration is starting to worry me a bit. I think it's too hard on deportations, on enforcement. We need to balance that discussion a little bit as to what we're going to do with, Congress is going to do with long-term solutions, and I think we've kind of left that off the conversation. It needs to come back in.
All right. Kristen, Mark, Daniel, thank you so much.
Thank you.